Letters from Spain. Letter 6. Spanish time and Spanish space. Hello. Well, this past week has been fairly unremarkable. Really, the only podcast-worthy thing that happened was yet another bad experience with Spanish banks. Basically, I went to a bank during my lunch break to try to pay some government fees for my visa, but I was turned away by no fewer than 3 separate banks. You see, it is common not only for banks to be open during quite restricted hours, which is why I had to go during my lunch break, but also to have even more ludicrously restricted hours when they allow you to actually do things like pay a government fee. It all reminds me of a book that I'm reading right now about useless jobs. But I can't let myself get sucked into another rant about Spanish banks, as gratifying as it would be. Today I want to talk about something different, the Spanish sense of time and space. The phrase Spanish time is familiar to every American who lives in Spain. The idea is basically that everything is always late, people arrive late, nothing starts on time, and so on. Now, I actually think this is an unfair stereotype. The vast majority of the people that I've worked with have been very punctual. In fact, I catch myself being late more often than my Spanish coworkers. Obviously, these things vary a lot from person to person. But I'd be willing to bet that if some kind of study were performed, it would be found that Spaniards are, on the whole, just as likely to show up on time for an engagement as an American. But I'm not suggesting that there's no such thing as Spanish time. Punctuality is only a tiny aspect of a culture's sense of time. In some ways, Spain is indeed extremely anomalous. This is most notable when it comes to meal times. Spaniards eat lunch and dinner quite late, even compared to their Mediterranean counterparts. Lunch at 3 is not unusual, and neither is dinner at 10. In fact, many tourists are annoyed to find that they cannot even keep to their American schedules, since it is common for kitchens in Spanish restaurants not to open until 1 o'clock, and then to close between, say, 4:30 and 8. So, no lunches at noon and no 6 o'clock dinners in Spain. Spanish time is strange in another respect. Though Spain occupies around the same latitude as England, it is 1 hour later in Spain than in England. This means that the sun rises and sets quite late in Spain. Right now, for example, the sun rises at around 8 in the morning and sets at around 6 in the evening. In the west of Spain, it's obviously a bit later. In fact, the sun rises at 8:30 and sets at 6:30. Meanwhile, the sun rises at around 6:45 in New York and sets at around 4:30. Now, the reason for this difference dates back to the Franco era, when he apparently switched the time zone of Spain to coincide with that of Germany, apparently in a gesture of goodwill towards Hitler. But England apparently switched its time zone to Central European time too at around the same time, around the year 1940, right before the Second World War. But after the war, England switched back and Spain stayed. A little strange. So maybe it's partly as a consequence of this off-kilter time zone that things tend to happen a bit later in Spain. For example, even though Spaniards have a reputation for laziness, it is common for Spanish people to work until 8 o'clock at night. Even workaholic Americans would not accept such hours as normal. Granted, Spaniards do often have a significant break in the middle of the day for lunch, at least an hour. This, of course, is the famous Spanish siesta. Now, there's a lot to say about the siesta. For one, sleeping in the middle of the day makes a lot of sense if you live in the south of the country where afternoon temperatures can make any activity impossible. But the more important point is that, for the vast majority of Spaniards, the siesta does not exist. Honestly, I wish it did. If I was given time to go home and nap for a bit every day, I'm sure I would feel a lot better in general. But the midday break is simply not long enough for most Spanish people to leave the office, go home, eat lunch, sleep, and then make it back to the office in time. I salute the lucky few who can, since I think it is a healthier and saner way to live. But the siesta is an important cultural institution nonetheless, even if it doesn't usually involve sleeping. This is because lots of things in Spain, shops, offices, and even churches, close around lunchtime. It takes a lot of getting used to, really, since this is normally the perfect time to do things, in the middle of the day. On the subject of Spanish time, we also must mention the schedule of Spanish partying. Just as Spaniards eat lunch and dinner late, they also go out late. Just the other day, I happened to be chatting with a bunch of Spanish people as they prepared to hit the town for Halloween. The clock had struck midnight before they even left the apartment. As you can imagine, if they only start at midnight, they don't stop until the wee hours of the morning. Partying all night in Spain is not only common, but the norm. I really have no idea how they do it, or why they want to. But if you want to have a good time with a group of Spanish people, make sure you don't have anything important to do the next morning. As you can see, Spanish time is in some ways quite different from American time. But I think that the Spanish version of space is, if anything, even more different than how we Americans think of space. The most obvious example of this is in the realm of personal space. Americans typically want a lot of it, and a lot more than Spanish people do. It is a common experience for Americans to find themselves backing away while speaking to Spaniards, since for us Americans it can feel like Spanish people just get way too close. I still have trouble with it sometimes. I just can't get used to talking with someone when their face is only a few centimeters from mine. But you do slowly adapt. I remember one time when I went back to America for the summer, I was told by the person in the post office that I should back away. When you're talking to someone behind a desk in Spain, you typically lean in quite a bit. Related to personal space is the issue of touching. In Spain, it is far more acceptable to casually touch somebody. This can take 1,000 forms, but it can really make Americans uncomfortable. In America, if a stranger is touching you, you are either very happy or in immediate danger. In other words, touching between strangers in America is rarely casual. For whatever reason, people in Spain have much less fear of sexual harassment, either being the victim of it or being accused of it, which is such a huge cloud hanging over American interpersonal relationships. When I first came to Spain, I thought that every man was dating every woman since they all touched each other in ways that struck me as extremely flirtatious. But I was wrong. To pick another example, primary school teachers in Spain have no issues hugging, kissing, or pinching the cheeks of their students, while in America this is a fearful taboo and might even be illegal. So personal space can be very different in Spain. But there is another difference which I think is quite a bit more interesting. This has to do with the difference between public and private space. In Spain, I think this contrast is far more sharp than in America. And I say this for a few reasons. For one, it is very common, even you might say the norm in the United States, to invite friends over or to be invited over. In my case, I spend the vast majority of my time with my American friends in someone's house, my house or their house. We go to a bar or a restaurant maybe a few times a month, and when we do go, we typically don't stay there for very long. But in Spain, this is a totally different story. Most friends, even good friends, meet outside the home in a neutral space. Whenever I ask my high school kids, my high school students, what they did over the weekend, they always say they went to the street, meaning they walked around or hung out in a park doing God knows what. I don't want to know. Likewise, adult friends are far more likely to meet in a bar or a restaurant than in someone's living room. Part of this is a simple preference. Compared to Americans, who are lovers of our own private property, Spanish people love to be in public, surrounded by people. Again, while an American might feel overwhelmed by an intensely crowded bar, many Spaniards seem to think this is an entirely good thing. The street, the bar, the cafe, the square, this is where life happens in Spain. And for this reason, Spain can be such a vibrant, energetic place to be. The people aren't in their homes, but outside, socializing in large numbers. You could even see this Spanish preference reflected when you see portions of the Spanish countryside from the air. Rather than a bunch of isolated farms scattered about, with people living in isolated families, just a farm here, a farm there, instead in Spain, the people live all bunched together, with miles and miles of uninhabited land all around them. They want to live on top of each other. I also think, as I said before, that Spanish people have a stronger sense of the divide between public and private than Americans do. For Spanish people, the home is just not a place to have a party. That's for public space. To illustrate this point, I think it is enlightening to think about Spanish and American homes. My home back in New York, for example, has a front lawn entirely open to the street. This is the American style. Most of the front windows can be easily seen from the outside. Anybody can just walk on the lawn and up to the door. By contrast, most of the houses I see in Spain, as in detached houses, have a wall that entirely encircles the property, making it difficult to see anything going on within or to enter the property at all without ringing the bell. To me, this has much more to do with the Spanish idea of a home as an isolated space than any functional purpose associated with a wall. To sum up, for a European country, Spain presents some striking contrasts to the United States. Why these differences arose is certainly a fascinating question, but a question that would take a lot of serious historical research to answer. For now, I am just content with pointing out the differences. Thank you.